Hi, everyone. To my delight and my honor, I had the chance to sit down and talk to Karen Swallow Pryor recently, specifically about her new book, The Evangelical Imagination with Brazos. Um, and yeah, this is a great book. I reviewed it on my channel. I really appreciate it, particularly the unique angle she brings to kind of understanding what's happening in evangelical American culture. But we talk a lot about the book in this conversation. We discuss some specific chapters of the book and particularly where, I kind of hate the question, like, where do you get your ideas from? But we kind of do talk about that. We talk about the story of behind how she started to identify Victorian culture as kind of the roots of a lot of what she was seeing in American evangelicalism. And so we had a really wonderful conversation about all of that. And then we also get into some really specific things, particularly had what I thought was a really fascinating discussion about her chapter on empire. So if you're really interested, especially in conversations about colonialism and race and injustice and kind of what that might have to do with Victorian culture as it's been transmuted into evangelical culture, I really appreciated that chapter in the book, and I really appreciated what she had to say about it in our conversation in the kind of the later half. So, but we talk about a lot of stuff. We also talk about, of course, in general, the word evangelical. What does that mean in our day? Should we hold on to it? What's the state of the culture? We kind of touch on all of that stuff as it relates to the topic of her book, but we mostly stick with some of the content of the evangelical imagination. So, without any further ado, I'll give you my conversation with Karen Swallow Pryor. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. I am really honored and excited to have some time with Karen Swallow Pryor, the author of this, well, as we record this upcoming, but as this releases, newly released book, The Evangelical Imagination. We were chatting right before recording about all our main connections. Maybe some of that will come up over the course of our conversation. I'm not sure, but really grateful that you're taking some time to have this conversation with me, Karen. I really appreciated your book, and I'd love to. Let's just get the conversation rolling with the standard opening question, which is some version of why this book right now. There's so many books about evangelicalism, evangelical culture, such a big reckoning with that happening right now. And I know you've been writing about it off and on. One of my first things I read from you on the topic was your contribution to the book Still Evangelical, in which you defend the continued use of the term. So why a book on evangelical culture right now? Why add to that pile?
Yeah, no, that's such a great question. And the truth is that I started formulating this book in my mind in 2019,
Mm.
which is, you know, seems longer ago than it was than it really is.
Yeah.
but
Yes.
it's still it was a while ago. And so as I talk about a little bit in the introduction, the emergence of it came from teaching a lot of Victorian literature in an evangelical setting, and as I was teaching a lot of Victorian literature, my students and I would notice connections with,
Mm.
21st century American evangelical culture. And I unpack that a lot more in the book.
Yeah.
But that was the germ of the idea. But a lot of things really, at least for me, have changed even since 2019.
Mm.
And some of these books that you even kind of are referring to, the books that have been coming out, have been coming out really more
Yeah.
recently than that. And so as I was thinking about this book and talking about it with my editor, I'm a slow writer and I do a lot of things, so it takes me a while to write a book. He did as all good editors do and kind of kept asking me, like, what's the so what? So what?
Mm.
So you've noticed this connection, so what?
Mm-hmm.
And as these other books started to come out, talking more about evangelicalism and the sort of the crisis we're facing, which that's another part of the story of this book, I began to see more of the so what. And
Mm.
so I a lot of the books that are coming out on this topic, as you know, are pretty critical, or they're
Yeah.
from outside evangelicalism. I still consider myself an evangelical,
Mm-hmm.
and I still want to redeem it if it can be redeemed. And I have a longer view of it, having studied it from the 18th
Yeah.
century on. And so I wanted to write something that was critical, but also loving, and also
Mm.
just basically an honest examination of, like, well, this is what's good. This is where got off track,
Yeah.
and what can we do with that? And so by the time I got to writing and finishing it, that's kind of where I wanted the book to land within the context of all these other books that are being written on that topic.
Yeah, that's great. I I definitely got that posture, the posture you just articulated of a loving criticism. I definitely get that posture from the book for sure.
Oh, good.
And yeah, in that way, it does stand out tonally, I would say, from a lot, maybe of what's being written. I'd love to, I don't know if you have any, you can recall any specific anecdotes or moments from your teaching. You said that it was your journey of teaching that really started to make these connections come alive. Um, do you remember any aha moments of like, oh yeah, here's a Victorian value that clearly maps onto an evangelical value as I see it? I'd love to hear some of those.
Yeah, and I would say this is probably sort of was the starting point in the center of the book, and I do cover this, and it really was a lot of the things that we see in Victorian literature and culture related to what we would call today purity culture within
Mm,
evangelicalism.
yeah.
So, for example, I often teach a novel by Thomas Hardy called Tess of the D'Urbervilles. I've edited a volume of that, one of my favorite works, and without getting too much into the weeds about that or giving any spoilers about it, because it's a great novel everyone should read.
Yeah.
Hardy, writing as a late Victorian, who has become basically, gone from Christian to atheism to agnosticism, he's really criticizing his evangelical culture's sexual double standard,
Mm,
whereby a man
yeah.
can be sexually impure and that's fine, and for a girl or a young woman it's literally a tragedy, as he shows
Yeah.
it in the novel. And so there are works like that. Another one that I actually do include in the book is a very famous and beloved poem from the era called The Angel of the House, in
Hmm.
which the narrator of the
Yeah.
poem, he's writing about his wife. He basically he calls his wife an angel and literally puts her on a pedestal.
Mm,
And so as we talk about especially those things related to men and women and purity culture, a lot of my students in the evangelical, who were raised in that subculture, saw a lot of connections. It said, and so I started asking the question.
mm.
So is our attitude about sexuality, is it really biblical, or is it more drawn from Victorian
More
culture?
Victorian.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you lay that question out pretty explicitly in the introduction. You say, and I can't remember if you're quoting someone else when you say this, but you say our evangelicals are more Victorian than they are evangelical, or something along those lines. Which
Yeah, that's
that's
that's pretty much me saying it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a that's a fascinating. I love that phrase as a kind of a way to capture the premise of your project. And as someone who I would say my wife is a lot more familiar with Victorian literature than I am. I'll put it that way. She loves Pride and Prejudice and Jane Austen and all of that. But so as someone who I'm pretty well read in fiction, but not in Victorian fiction, your book is a wonderful intro to a lot of that stuff, and an accessible kind of overview of it. But what I'm getting at is that that sentence brought me up short because
Mhm.
I don't have all those historical touch points you do with the Victorian period, and I thought, oh my gosh, what a stark question for someone who doesn't have this exposure. And so if you're watching this and you're like me, this book will probably be quite actually illuminating. But I also want to build off kind of your methodology. So like you started and kind of the story of how the book came to be. So you started noticing these connections in dialogue and partnership with your students. Some of these pieces you're talking about purity culture. I would love to hear a little bit about how you drafted your table of contents. Like, how did you? Because for those who haven't seen the book, it's thematically organized, so each chapter kind of captures a Victorian cultural value, and you draw connections. So I guess I'd love to just hear, how did you draft that list? How did you narrow down the list? How did you separate certain themes out? That seems like quite a significant undertaking.
Hmm. Well, I think what's most significant is what's left out,
Mm,
rather than what's in, because
mm,
there's so much. My goal for anyone who's reading this book who is, who cares about evangelicalism or has a background in evangelicalism, pro or con,
mm,
can look at it and say, oh, well, what about this or this? Like all the things that I couldn't include, right?
mm,
Because this is just, and that I hopefully I'm modeling for them to kind of think
yeah.
through the stories, images, and metaphors that create this evangelical social imaginary, because there's so many more ingredients of it. But the way that I chose what I did is it was kind of twofold. I mean, I I selected what I think are sort of the most central metaphors or images or ideas within evangelicalism for the past 300 years,
Mm.
like conversion,
Yeah.
right? I
Yep.
mean, if we go back to the beginnings of the evangelical revival, conversion was a central part of the right, the whole evangelical movement, and it still is. We still,
Mm-hmm.
and so that was an easy one. So to pick
Mm.
the theme of conversion, say, oh, and then I would say, okay, well, what are the stories, the images, the songs, the poems, the artwork that our culture has imbibed for 300 years in silly or significant ways, because in the imagination those things don't necessarily separate out. And also, what are the ones that that I have the most expertise in, which of
Mm-hmm.
course is literature. That's where I think I'm strongest, and specifically of the British Victorian period. I try to cover American literature and culture. I'm not as knowledgeable in that area, but I've studied and read some of it. So yeah, it's just I just picked what I thought were the most important aspects of evangelicalism that I could see a lot of cultural
Yeah.
resonance with. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you highlight conversion there. I mean, that is such a, I don't want to use the term obvious, but yeah, it is just an obvious starting point in a lot of ways. Um, but I loved how, so let's get into the actual kind of meat and potatoes of the book, so to speak. I loved how you drew a distinction between awakening and conversion.
Mhm.
I talk to me about how you saw those as
Mhm.
distinct values.
No, that's a really great question. And I'm thinking back on the writing process. I mean, you know, I it was interesting because as I said, my expertise is in British literature and British history, and I wanted, writing for an American audience, so I needed to
Yeah,
cover what was happening in America, because we're really talking about 21st century American evangelicalism,
right.
that is the crisis. And so I just started to think about the difference between the term, in England it was the Evangelical Revival, in America the Great Awakening.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And
Hmm.
so, right. And as I delved in, I realized, I just started to think about how awakening really is different. Like, that does precede a conversion.
Yeah.
And so just as I began to think about those two theological concepts, and then just sort of the imagination around them, it was
Hmm.
very clear. But that distinction, really, it wasn't something I set out to do. It actually was just the direct result of the writing process and
Yeah, that's what it sounds
researching,
like.
and
Yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah. And those are, even as you're talking about it now, it's reminding me that those are different theological ideas and
mhm.
anthropological ideas. You
Right,
go
right,
lots of
right, right.
there is a significant difference if you really press into it. So it sounds like that emerged kind of organically in your study. Are
Mhm.
there any other? I know I always hesitate when I ask these questions because I know there's a big gap between the actual writing and the actual publication of the book. So I apologize if I'm trying to uh, pull up ancient memories here, but are there other chapters that emerged like that were almost a
Mhm.
surprise for you in terms of these values?
Actually, almost, I would say half of them were surprise or more
Really?
were
Oh, wow. Okay.
surprises. Yeah.
Okay.
And a quick answer to that is just that conversion, the chapter on conversion and testimony, started out as one chapter, and it got so
Oh,
big, I
that
realized,
makes
oh,
sense.
wait, this, I need to break this up, and they really are two different things.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So like conversion and then the story of the conversion.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would say the biggest surprise, I knew going in that I would write a chapter on sentimentality, because I write and think a lot about
Mm-hmm.
sentimentality and kitsch and bad art versus good
Yeah.
art. I
Yes.
mean,
Yes.
we know that's a big deal in evangelicalism.
That's the
But what
Thomas Kincaid chapter, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, yeah.
Mhm.
Well, and actually I cover them in two chapters, but that's
Yeah.
the yeah, I mainly cover them that. But then as a result of my research and writing, and I was not planning on this, um I was researching an area that's new to me called material culture. And
Oh,
yeah, and so
okay.
I became convinced myself that I'm too dismissive of sentimentality. I still am, but I was too
Hmm.
dismissive, and that I needed to acknowledge, as the scholars that I cite in the chapter that follows that one on materiality,
Mm-hmm.
that that material items and objects and processes are part of being human, and therefore they are also deeply embedded in our religious experience, and
Yeah.
that's just normal and that's good. And so that entire section on materiality was a surprise to me. The entire field, which is fascinating to me, and the scholars that I read, that I'm just really excited about. That was a whole new area of learning for me. So.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, thanks for that. I love hearing how books come together. I love hearing the stories of some of the themes. So that's super interesting. Um, Honestly, it's really hard for me to. We've already named a few. It's hard for me to narrow down which ones. We don't have time to talk about every chapter systematically. Um, but we've already commented on sentimentality. I loved that chapter. I've always wrestled with it myself. I'm a musician. I was musically trained in college and stuff, and so I've wrestled a lot with that more on the musical art side of evangelical culture, feeling that the shallow sentimentality that sometimes can come up. So I really appreciated your chapter, gave a lot of language for that. Also appreciated the chapter on domesticity, which we've kind of alluded to a little bit with some of the purity culture stuff, but I think for those who, particularly those who are watching, who might be wrestling with a lot of the publishing on purity culture, that chapter is a really interesting glimpse. But I'd also love to mention the Empire chapter. That was one of my favorites. So could you talk a little bit about how that one came to be and how, I don't know, what was the process of bringing that one into the book?
Yeah, no. So the Empire chapter, I knew I would write about that topic. I wasn't sure exactly how I'd approach it, but again, because I teach Victorian literature,
Yeah,
and that is the age that was, when the sun was never going to set on the British
yeah,
Empire. And I do teach works like Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which is showing the
hmm,
dark side of imperialism, and Rudyard Kipling's poetry, which I
yeah,
discuss at length in that chapter. Um, and I have come to see, and I'm maybe late to the party, but I have just come to see for myself as a somewhat naive and optimistic evangelical. It's still, still loving it, but wanting
yeah,
to see it better. From harsher critics, I am seeing how
hmm,
colonialism and imperialism are just part of the evangelical mindset,
hmm,
in literal and metaphorical ways. And so, having taught the literature of empire within the British Empire for so long, I couldn't not address that, and I couldn't not
yeah,
address the way that evangelicalism and imperialism just grew up next to one another. And so, of all the this one is different from the others, I would say, because all of the other themes are ones that, I would say are basically good things gone bad, right? Or,
yeah, yeah, I see that.
I'm showing
Hmm.
sort of the negative and the positive. With Empire, it's pretty much negative.
Yeah,
So yeah, yeah. and
yeah,
and I know that there are people, who would push back and talk about all the good that imperialism and colonialism has done to
right.
and brought to other countries, but that's what the whole history has been. And it needs to be questioned. We don't have to throw out everything good, but I feel like, evangelical America, 21st century American evangelicalism is in the place where it's not asking enough of those questions. And
Mm,
so that's what I want this chapter to help, my audience do.
yeah, I think that's really fair. And well, it's making me think of Willie Jennings' Christian Imagination, and which actually I hadn't made this connection before just now, but his concept of the diseased imagination, which I think
Mm-hmm.
he draws on Charles Taylor a lot for that, the social imaginary concept as well, which I love, by the way, that you drew on Taylor. He's one of my favorite just cultural theorists, I guess. Anyway, so yeah, there's a fascinating, I think, connection there that would underline the point you just made about, maybe this is bad all the way down and in terms of some of the and but something I also really liked about that chapter was I thought you did honestly I thought you did an admirable job kind of looking starkly at like Kipling's poetry, for example, and saying like threading a needle of like he may have genuinely thought there was like a good moral thrust to the project of the white man's burden, but we can stand here and say that that was very wrong. And we can
Right,
actually
right,
say that. And
right.
I think that is a hard in our, especially right now with the conversations being so fraught around that topic. I think that is a really hard tone to strike. And I honestly think that chapter did it really well. So
Oh,
I just wanted to,
thank
I guess I
you.
just wanted to underline that. And it makes sense that would, even as you say that, I can see the slight dissonance of that chapter with the rest in terms of it being a little bit more of just a critique. But I think it's important that it's included in the book. Um, okay, hopefully this has given a smattering of kind of what the book's about. We've talked a little bit. We didn't touch on all the topics, all the chapters, but hopefully the viewer kind of has a sense of what they're getting into when they crack this thing open. I would love to now get into some critique of evangelicalism, if we can. Like how you use the image at the beginning of floorboards in a house. Like some are rotting, some are more solid, some might be somewhere in the middle, some might need to be replaced. Maybe I'm expanding on the the metaphor, but I would love just what's some of your take on what's rotting or what's good. Start on either end, especially as you lay it out.
Yeah. Well, I'll start with what's good because that's easier for me to answer, I guess. And I do lay this out in the book. A lot of people just don't even, there's a lot of debate about how to define evangelicalism and what it is and how it's different from a denomination and so forth. And historians and academics have done that. That's out there. Just your average evangelical may not know it. And so I do present in very basic terms that outline. And I think David Bebbington's, widely accepted definition of just evangelicalism, emphasizing, as I've already mentioned, the conversion experience, the centrality and authority of the Bible, and the centrality of Christ's crucifixion for our salvation, and then the activist spirit, which took the form of missions the first couple of centuries, and now it takes a lot of other forms. Yeah, I think that still really defines what an evangelical is, and I think as an evangelical, as a Christian, I think people do need to be saved. They do need to be converted. And I do believe in the Bible as, the inspired word of God that is authoritative for every area of life. And so the basic definition of evangelicalism, I think, is good. And yet if I had to sum it all up, which in a way that I actually really don't in the book, at least not explicitly, I think, what's happened in our own context, our 21st century American context. I mean, I allude to this in the book, but it's just so wrapped up in American culture, right? In the American dream. I do mention that in commercialism and consumption and materialism. It is so hard to separate out what evangelicalism has become from 21st century modern American life, that I think those are the kinds of things that we have to separate out. And that require, and that's what I'm trying to model in this book. I certainly, is just a start. But it's something that we can all do. And I'm just hoping that reading this book will help people, kind of figure out, where, as I said before, where else can we do this? Where else do I see this entanglement that needs to be disentangled?
Yeah. Oh man, I appreciate that. I find the conversation about what is an evangelical, I kind of wonder if we can just hit pause on that for a while. Like, well, I think I just wonder if we've said enough about, hand wringing around that particular question. I don't know, probably not, but there's just been so much said and so many competing viewpoints. And I guess what I'm getting at is what I find tiring sometimes and slippery about it is that we pivot so quickly from defining it theologically to defining it culturally to defining it politically to defining it sociologically, and like we make those pivots all in the same conversation, all under the same broad term of evangelical, and it can just get so confusing and sloppy in terms of what are we actually really talking about. And I guess, sorry, I'm like really good at asking long wind-up questions.
I'm
tracking.
I
guess good. I guess what I'm getting at is that your book pretty squarely, you kind of say, and you even just articulated it now, you kind of said, like, yeah, the theological definition is good. Bebbington, solid, makes sense. A lot of people would sign up for that. Let's set that aside, and now let's talk about it as a culture. And I feel like you do a clear pivot as opposed to just like, a sneaky one. You do a clear one. It's like, let's look at our culture, and then you make a specific historical argument about this culture is rooted somewhere specific, which gives us it gives handles to the whole thing that frankly can be missing, I think, in a lot of other conversations about what is evangelical, who belongs, who doesn't belong, all of that. So I find that really helpful. I don't know, does that provoke any reaction or comments on your end?
No, I mean, it just what you're saying, what you're pointing out is the problems that we have in many of these conversations that's really helpful to point out.
Mm,
And because we are so many of the conversations are conflating the categories, and the label's been hijacked by
right.
pollsters and surveys and headline writers, and so a lot of times we're not only not having the same definition of evangelical, but we're not even defining whether we're talking about its theology, its doctrine, or culture, or whatever. So I think
Yeah.
I think what you've said is really helpful to have better discussions about it.
Well, and I find myself, so I'm a pastor in an evangelical space, an evangelical church community, and I find myself really frustrated sometimes because I'm like, well, I'm not what you just described, but but I was with you 5 minutes ago, and now I'm suddenly not with you anymore. And I think it's because of these pivots that people take.
Mm.
So anyways, I'm just trying to say that I like the angle you took. Your book reminded me in some ways of Daniel Silliman's book on the publishing industry, because it kind of was more of a let's look at
Mm.
the culture shaping and not get sidelined by all these
Mm.
like
Mm.
sociological or theological definitions, but let's just look at the felt experienced culture,
Right. Right.
which is super super helpful. So okay, so back to the floorboards kind of image. I think earlier I heard you right to say that empire might be one of the ones in terms of your chapters. That might be one of the ones
Mm.
that's the
Mm.
most rotting. Maybe needs to
Right.
be pulled
Right.
out of the
Right.
house
Right.
ASAP. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. Are there others? Given the caveat you said earlier that there's good and bad mixed up. There's. I
Mm-hmm.
think you used the analogy of virtue as moderation a lot throughout these chapters. Like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, are there others that you would target as like higher priorities that we need to reevaluate or we need to rethink?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good question. So, I mean, and I think going back to empire, if empire is the foundation, which I think some
Ooh,
people could make an argument that it is,
ooh,
then that opens up a whole other
yeah.
kind of question.
Yikes.
And yeah, I mean, I think that's a question that we do have to ask. For example, I do remember someone because I've studied William Wilberforce and his friends a fair
Mm-hmm.
amount and written on them, and so Wilberforce is always and John Newton, his mentor. They're always people that I like to look at as examples because most of what they did is so good and admirable. And Newton was actually an example of someone that I was thinking of when I was thinking about the difference between awakening and conversion, because
Oh, sure.
his conversion was so slow,
Yeah, yeah. Uh-huh.
his awakening, his conscience, it just took many different steps and years for him to really come around to understanding the slave trade for what it was.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but if I remember the first time that I heard someone say that an abolitionist could still be racist, and it just like it was a completely new. It was a
Yeah,
totally new idea to me at that
yeah,
time, and I mean it's been
sure.
some time, but thinking about something, just one thing like that can help us to separate out, like, what is the
Yes.
foundation, what is the floor joist, what is the beam. I'm not That's the limit
Yeah.
of my construction knowledge, but
Yeah.
yeah, when
Yeah.
really I mean, what we all know is the foundation needs to be um
Yeah.
Jesus and the word,
Yeah.
right? And so that's kind of my call at the end, is to just we can never separate ourselves entirely from culture, and God designed it this way. He put us here on this earth. So it's part of his plan for us to be in human cultures on this earth for a time. And so, but that is the job that we have, is to
Yeah.
distinguish between our earthly, human, temporary, limited cultures and the eternal word of God, and to figure out, and to make him the foundation, and not our systems and institutions and traditions and cultures. But we are not good at doing that.
Man, that's good. So that tees up so many thoughts. Why? But let me ask you, why do you think, just hazard a diagnosis or your own thoughts? Why do you think we're not good at that? We meaning evangelical culture
Yeah.
broad.
Oh, yeah, yeah, no. Okay. As opposed to like just fallen humans. No,
Yeah, yeah,
you asked a good hard question. Okay, so I'll speak from my own place
yeah.
as an evangelical, and just from my perspective. I think it's because we have a hard time because we have been the ones in power for so
Mm-hmm.
long.
Sure. Yeah.
And it is a lot harder to ask those questions when we're the ones who've been winning most of the time and have the most to lose from our, losing from any kind of shift that would take place in the foundation.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say we're talking about broadly white
Yeah,
evangelical,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah,
culture
yeah,
in the
yeah,
states in
yeah.
particular, or the West more
Mhm,
broadly. But
mhm,
yeah, wow, yeah, absolutely. I think, and I wonder how much of this is a subset of the power diagnosis, kind of the cultural comfortable position of privilege and power we
mhm,
occupy. But like,
mhm,
I wonder, something I think about a lot is we again, I'm evangelical too. Catch me on a certain day. I don't know whether I describe myself that way, but for now, I'll say it. I'm talking with Karen Swallow Prior, so I'll say it. As an evangelical too, I think I just see a general lack of our ability to historicize ourselves.
mhm, mhm,
And I
mhm,
wonder how much of that is a feature or a bug of evangelicalism,
mhm,
especially when combined with the centralization of cultural power that you're talking about. And I just wonder how much of that, I guess, man, this is like 17 questions bundled into one, but I wonder how much of that is a natural outcome of any group that's going to be at the center of
mhm,
power for an extended period of time, and how much of that is actually built
mhm,
into the populist kind of thrust of evangelical revivalist culture,
mhm,
that wants to cut itself off from,
mhm,
or or you
mhm,
can go to the Reformation. Like I don't know,
mhm,
I don't know where to link this stuff, but I
mhm,
see that trend, and it troubles me because I think it lends to a lot of this, what we're talking about an inability
mhm,
to diagnose. We've got
mhm,
imperialism maybe in the foundation of our house that might need to be excavated. And if you don't have any
mhm,
historicization, any
mhm,
sense of
mhm,
that, that's just like a radically
mhm,
threatening idea to you. So yeah, so I
mhm,
don't know. That was a bit of a
mhm,
rambly
mhm,
response, but
mhm.
I'm curious what your reaction to any of that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a fruitful direction for all the observations you made, but the one I'll pick up on is,
Yeah.
and I think I mentioned this a couple places in the book, is just our individualist
Yes.
practice, faith practice, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that makes it so even just, we're so good at, dealing with sins that are moral sins of an individual, like,
Mm-hmm.
so, like, don't do this, that's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Um, get, repent, seek forgiveness. But it's very hard for us to see how sin, affects communities and cultures and
Yeah.
systems, because we focus on conversion of an
Mm-hmm.
individual and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
individual growth and discipleship, and I am an evangelical, so I do love those things, but this is the shortcoming, and that
Yeah.
also breaks us off from our history because we just think everything is about Jesus and me and my
Yes.
own piety or lack of
Mhm.
morality or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
We're used to dealing with things on an individual basis.
Yeah, and it seems to me that we have no sense of the idea that anything might mediate that between me and God. Like, and you
Mhm,
talked about this earlier with the inevitability of cultural entanglement. That's kind of what your book is
mhm, basically.
basically about. Like,
Mhm,
let's try to turn the lens and look at this, but the reality that that culture is going to mediate this stuff on some degree, and
mhm,
institutions are going to mediate this on some
mhm,
degree, um, and the instinctual kind of denial of that, which feels
mhm,
like it feels so
mhm,
threatening. The book Divided by Faith gets into all that. I think that some of the sociological tools of what they diagnose there can be really helpful with this, but the underlying theme is that combination of individualism and emphasis on conversion, and then which it gets into the emphasis on the story and all the stuff that you're talking about, but it is all individually circumscribed.
right,
Like
right.
your chapter on testimony, it's fascinating because the testimonies that are valued are individual stories, not corporate stories.
Mhm, mhm,
Not the
mhm,
stories of a church, or not the stories of,
mhm,
anyways. So man, it's so frustrating because it's the stuff that does make it beautiful. Like you said, the
mhm,
stuff that makes evangelicalism beautiful is also the stuff that can be such
mhm,
a tripwire, for everything that we're talking about. Um, well, what would you say? Let's flip the script a little bit. So those are some things that might be worth reevaluating, questioning, replacing. I don't know. What are some things that you want to emphasize that are good, that might need a
mhm,
little
mhm,
moderation, but they're no, we should really keep these in the house?
mhm, mhm. Well, this question leads to what's probably my favorite chapter in the book, which,
Hmm.
we've mentioned briefly, but didn't talk about a lot, and that is the one on domesticity.
Yeah. Okay.
And so, I mean, kind of a big hot topic right now for many
Yeah.
reasons. It is, masculinity and femininity and egalitarianism and complementarianism
Yeah.
and male and female roles in the church and all of that. And
Let's try to crack
you know,
that nut in about 10
yeah, yeah,
minutes. So,
yeah.
yeah.
And I didn't really want to add to that discussion. There's so much that's going on because, and it's an important discussion, but I
Hmm.
didn't think that was what evangelicalism, because it does include like a lot of different views on those issues. What I wanted to point to that evangelicalism contributed, and actually this chapter is the one that's most positive,
Hmm.
is domesticity,
Hmm.
is the emphasis on the domestic life, the emphasis on family,
Hmm.
the emphasis on 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 family life, and sort of the home as a sanctuary. Now I point out how the excesses can go too far, as they
Sure.
always can, but one of the points that I make, and again, this is drawing heavily on my area of expertise, which is
Yeah.
has to do with the rise of the domestic novel in England, is that I basically argue that evangelicalism helped women in the 19th century and beyond by giving us agency and voice,
Hmm.
and by elevating and promoting the idea of a companionate marriage rather than a marriage just based on like political or economic expediency, and choosing a marriage for both men and women to choose marriage partners based on like character,
Hmm.
rather than wealth or material or family connections or so forth, and that has been good for men and women.
Hmm.
And that's something evangelicalism contributed to, if didn't create single-handedly.
Yeah.
So
Oh, that's
yeah.
wonderful. That's a wonderful pushback's maybe too strong of a word for it, but it's a wonderful inclusion of a certain way of interpreting that
Mhm.
value that does seem to be lacking in a lot of the conversations that are happening around it. And it's just so helpful. Again, to historicize it, it's helpful to see where it emerges, as you argue,
Right, right.
from
Mhm,
in certain
mhm,
popularization of certain types of stories and all that. That's really helpful. I'm glad that you brought that up. I actually just recently interviewed Zach Wagner, who wrote
mhm.
Non-Toxic Masculinity. Yeah, we had a great
Right,
conversation,
right.
as two older millennials who lived through the purity culture thing. So it's fascinating. I'm just thinking about that book and that conversation and conversation
Mhm,
with your work, and of course all of the conversations that are happening around the excesses of domesticity. But I love the idea of like pausing all of that and recovering some germ of value
mhm,
there at the root of it. That's really helpful. Um, wow. Well, okay, we've covered a lot of ground. I'm
mhm,
going to be respectful of your time, so I think this feels like a pretty natural ending kind of point for this conversation. I'm going to ask you just one question about what you're working on, what do you want to point people to next. But I also reviewed this book for my channel. I'll point listeners to that if they haven't seen my review yet. But I would definitely recommend the Evangelical Imagination for. I think it's both for people who have done a lot of reading on evangelical culture because it does bring that interesting, unique angle to it. But I would say it's also for someone who maybe hasn't even really wrestled with it yet, honestly, because it's a good starting point for looking at
mhm,
purely that cultural lens, and then you can go off and look into some of the theological and history and all that stuff. But yes, yeah. So that's what my final kind of plug for the book. But I do really appreciate the way that you've entered this conversation. That's broadly happening. So,
mhm.
what are you working on next? What else can we look forward to?
Well, by the time this comes out, this book will be launching, and I will hopefully be starting on my next book proposal anyway, which I don't like to
Great.
say too much ahead of
Sure.
time, but
Sure.
I
Yeah.
do already have another book in mind, and hopefully it won't take me 5 years to write it and get it out, because I'm moving into full-time writing. So, and
Oh,
yeah, and
excellent.
so yeah, I guess anyone can. I have a website, karenswallowprior.com, maybe beginning a newsletter by the time this comes out. And yeah, so just look for me and be
Excellent.
part of my writing and reading community. And yeah,
That's
that
great.
would be great.
Well, thank you, and thanks for your voice. In general, honestly, thanks
You,
for your voice in all these
you.
conversations. It's you're a good follow on Twitter too. So
Oh, thank you.
I'll throw that out there. All right, thank you, Karen. Really appreciate your
Thank
time.
you, Joel.